One of the wildest ideas to ever exit out of the mind of the white elites was this idea that those who they labeled as blacks were somehow something other than humans. This idea, it was given life by a few of the prominent thinkers during the time. Men who held positions of persuasion that impacted the opinions and the beliefs of many people within the early American society. And just like many other ideas used to promote an aura of inferiority around the blacks, this concept too was used as a means to justify a set of behaviors and practices that were designed to degrade and destroy. And so let's talk about it. And for us to do that, we're going to go into the book here, Race in North America by Dr. Audrey Smedley. And so let's go in here and turn to page 168, where she says this. As early as 1680 in the colonies, Winthrop Jordan notes, the Reverend Morgan Godwin attempted to refute an allegation that Negroes were not truly men. And this is coming from the book White Over Black on page 229, Dr. Winthrop D. Jordan, where he's quoting the good Reverend, who is basically saying that people are creating a disingenuous narrative about these Negroes being similar to men in shape, but they're not really humans, right? And so the Reverend Godwin, he's one of the people who did advocate somewhat on the behalf of the enslaved, and primarily because he was interested in converting them over to Christianity, right? And saving their souls. But there were others who promoted this idea of the subhuman blacks. Let's keep reading. What had prompted this speculation was that both the apes of Africa and African peoples had been discovered by Englishmen at about the same time. And in the minds of some imaginative travelers and writers of tall tales, the two had been subtly linked together. And let me show you an example of an account created by these very imaginative travelers to Africa. This is from the article Before Othello, Elizabethan Representation of Sub-Saharan Africans by Drs. Alden and Virginia Vaughan. And it says this. Mandeville's description of Ethiopians illustrate the contradictory and often warped information about Africa that reached English readers in the late 15th century and beyond. This writing we're going to see that reached the English readers in the 15th century is said to have been written in the middle of the 1300s by this traveler who was supposed to be an Englishman. And here's his account. In this land of the South are the folk right black, Mandeville reported. In Ethiopia are such men that have but 1 foot, and they go so fast that it is a great marvel, in that it is a large foot that the shadow thereof covereth the body from the sun or rain when they lie upon their backs. And when their children are first born, they look like russet. And when they wax old, then they be all black. You see that? Creating these highly exaggerated accounts about some very unhuman-like beings, right? With descriptions of people running very fast with 1 foot and children transforming from a russet color into black as they get older, right? And accounts like these were extremely entertaining to the English people, right? These were a very useful source of entertainment. They used to do public readings with these types of stories, and I know they just loved hearing about these distant creatures changing colors like chameleons into something black, right? And so this is part of the subtle linking of humans with beasts, right? And other narratives inside of these types of accounts include headless people, people walking around eating flesh, right? All types of wild and imaginative records that they recorded, right? So let's go back to Dr. Smedley and see what else she has to say. Here we go. In some circles, it was held that ape males and black females in the wilds of Africa sometimes copulated, which is another foolish idea that they fashioned in the world of imagination. Englishmen were obviously titillated by the presumed lewdness and promiscuity of Africans, and this imagery has persisted throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. Jordan believes that a handful of assertions that Negroes were not truly humans were not advanced seriously, largely because of the strength of Christian tradition. Humans differed from beasts in that they had speech, were capable of rational thought, and possessed souls waiting to be saved. The Negro was indubitably human, but this did not prevent the growth in the 18th century of the perception that blacks were closer to the apes than to other human groups. As the barbarities of slavery progressed, it was easier to seize upon such speculations about the physical resemblance of Negroes to apes to diminish the humanness of the slave. right? To drag them further down into the darkest depths of the dungeon. Belief in black inferiority increased throughout the 18th century. It came to be expressed in a variety of forms and among some individuals who had quite legitimate claims to scholarship and erudition, as we have already seen. And what's the key word here? Belief. It didn't matter if this inferiority were actually true. They were able to forge it into a truth by getting nearly an entire society to grab hold of this idea with their belief, right? Understand the power of belief. Here we go. Edward Long, a jurist and planner for 12 years in the West Indies, published a volume entitled History of Jamaica, in which he revealed a doctrinaire set of beliefs about Africans that English planters in Jamaica and elsewhere accepted as explicitly and as tenaciously as they held to biblical history, which means this was as good as the gospel for some of them, and they clinged on to this for dear life, right? Let's see what's in it. The volume was first published in 1774 in England, and sections of it attracted greater attention in the United States after they were reprinted in 1788. In the Columbian magazine, which also published excerpts from Jefferson's writings, Long's book was designed primarily as a justification for slavery in Jamaica. Although at first a treatise of little significance, in the 19th century it had a major influence on the Southern pro-slavery thought. Long's rationalization for black slavery was one of the first popular ones that incorporated some of the speculations and language of the developing sciences of humankind. And remember, Long was a jurist or an expert in law and also a plantation owner. So he had every incentive to use his power of interpretation, to use the tool of law and the tool of science to make a piece of work that benefited his situation, right? And here's what he said. He argued that the Negro was a separate species from white men and described their physical differences in terms that made them appear closer to beast than to humans. Here we go. Instead of hair, they have a head covering of wool, like the bestial fleece. They differ also in the roundness of their eyes, the figure of their ears, two mid-nostrils, invariable thick lips, and general large size of the female nipples, as if adapted by nature to the particular conformation of their children's mouths. Pay attention. The lice that infest their bodies are black, and they have a bestial or fetid smell. Here they go with the black thing, right? They love to add this black part when they paint the picture to make it more intense or more extreme, right? They'll find any way to make anything black and then try to attach it to who they call the Negro. But let's keep reading. However, it was in the faculties of the mind that the Negro showed the greatest disparity. In general, Long argued, they are void of genius and seem almost incapable of making any progress in civility or science. They have no plan or system of morality among them, it being a common known proverb that all people on the globe have some good as well as ill qualities, except the African. Meaning that the African's qualities are all just negative, right? Everyone else has a variation of good and bad ones, but those of African descent, they only have bad qualities. But pay attention, because Mr. Long is about to spice it up and season it up to the next level. Here we go. He then went on to rank the Negro and the orangutan on the chain of being in a position intermediate between man and the lower primates, stating that the orangutan and some races of black men are very nearly allied is, I think, more than probable. So the chain of being structures the world from the highest ranking member, which is God in the heavenly realm, down to the mineral kingdom, and humans make up the central position in this chain, and the lower apes, including the orangutans, are right below them. And so Mr. Long was saying that the blacks are pretty much right there with the orangutans, right? This is what else he said. The gradation rises from monkey to ape to orangutan to the Ghanaian Negroes, and ascending from the variety of this class to the lighter caste until we mark its utmost limit of perfection in the pure white. You see that? In his view, Negroes are just one step above the orangutan. And then after that, it comes other humans of various shades of colors until you get to the highest level of perfection, which obviously they're going to put as the pure white, or in other words, the English, who were the masters of creating these type of ideologies to pull people's consciousness down into the pit and try to lift theirs way up, right? Let's keep reading. Long's characterization of the Negro was a subjective exegesis, harboring and enhancing folk stereotypes that became a significant part of the American heritage. In his view, the Negro, in addition to being devoid of intellect, was given to excess, lacking in moral restraints, and prone to idleness and thievery. And these are some of the ideas that the Negroes came to believe about themselves as well, right? So it became a self-fulfilling prophecy, especially for those in America, right? Think about it and don't fall within any of these definitions that are placed under a Negro. Let's keep going. Dwelling on what he thought were the lascivious and rapacious tendencies of this creature, Long averred that it was the Negro's uncontrolled sexuality that was most troublesome, a quality that made him most like a beast. In his assertions about the Negro's affinity to the ape or orangutan, Long played up the theme of the male of a lower species having a passion for the female of a higher form, meaning the male ape jumping wild with the woman. Here's what else he said. Ludicrous as the opinion may seem, I do not think that an orangutan husband would be any dishonor to any Hottentot female. A Hottentot was what they were calling the Khoi tribe over there in South Africa. Let's keep going. The simile of an ape male passionately embracing a black woman was not lost on white society, which showed a growing but baseless fear of black male rape. For about a century, a small minority of individuals had continued to believe that the major groupings of humankind represented distinct species. Among the notable and influential scholars of the 18th century were the philosophers Voltaire and the jurist Lord Keynes, who provided not scientifically based arguments, but what they thought were rational ones for the separation of blacks and Indians as distinct and inferior species. Now let's see what they had to say. Both reasoned on the basis of differences in physical features that there must have been unique creations for the 3 or 4 major races. It was the Negro, however, who provided the significant foil against which the contraposition of the white appeared immeasurably superior. And contraposition is placing two things in opposition to highlight the differences. And so in this instance, the blacks being in a position at the bottom was used to shed light on the whites being at the top in a superior position. Understand? Let's continue. Said Voltaire of Negroes, they are not capable of any great application or association of ideas, and seem formed neither for the advantages nor the abuses of philosophy. It should be noted that Voltaire had investments in the slave trade. Of course he did. The Scottish philosopher David Hume was among the first to suggest in 1748 what was to become in the 19th century a dominant theory of history. We heard about what the great Scottish philosopher David Hume had to say in the last video. And guess what? We're going to hear about what he has to say again. Here it is. I am apt to suspect, he said, the Negroes, and in general all other species of men, for there are 4 or 5 different kinds, to be naturally inferior to the whites. And naturally means that they came into existence and were created that way from the beginning. Not something that they learned or inherited over time, but that they were designed that way, right? This is a very powerful statement here. Here we go. There never was any civilized nation of any other complexion than white, nor even any individual eminent either in action or speculation. No ingenious manufacturers amongst them, no arts, no sciences. He believed that even the most primitive whites, such as the ancient Germans and Tartars, had some positive qualities that redeemed them. The only rational explanation for these striking differences was that nature had made an original distinction betwixt these breeds of men. The works of these European scholars were widely read by the educated American public. Intellectuals in both North and South converged in their thinking, particularly about the nature of the Negro and the causes of his inferiority. So great had the distinction between whites and blacks become in the collective consciousness that toward the end of the 18th century, a major controversy began taking shape, comprehending broad and scientific speculations. And this is when they began to use the tool of science to work over the Negro and to find ways to categorize them in the way that they saw fit. Here we go. This was the great debate between the polygenist and the monogenist, over the origin and taxonomic status of the Negro, which received inordinate attention for several decades in the mid-19th century. And polygynist meaning multiple origins and monogynist meaning single origin. The polygynists believe that the Negroes originated from an entirely separate race of people. But the monogynists, they believe in a single origin, right? Which stemmed from the biblical creation story of the Adam and Eve, right? Here we go. The debate became the central focus of developing sciences in the United States and involved biologists, anatomists, physicians, antiquarians, politicians, social theorists, and others. Look at everybody who came to the party. Watch this. One perceives during the mid to late 18th century a tremendous acceleration in the thrust to magnify the differences between blacks and whites. Here we go. As Jordan notes, a few men were so intent over distinguishing Negroes from whites that they proceeded to invent the facts that they were unable to discover. They claimed variously that the Negro's blood, brains, and skull were black, doing the same stuff that some of their ancestors did when writing those travelers' tales, talking about seeing people with black skin and running around fast with only 1 foot. Wild stuff like this, right? Now we have an account with people inventing the facts of Negroes having a brain, skull, and blood that's the color of black. Wild stuff, right? But here we go. Let's keep going. The term race, with its basis in heredity and descent, cohered as the symbol of all these differences. Although it may have appeared ill-defined, its cognitive correlates were increasingly specific and tangible in the mental images held by whites. Meaning the term race may not have been completely defined during this time, but the whites already had a mental image of what a black person was and what a white person was, right? Let's keep going. Jordan claims that the term race at the time of Jefferson was characterized by total absence of any precise meaning. But the evidence that he himself provides of the range of white beliefs and attitudes shows a far more concrete conceptualization of race and race differences than he would allow. Jordan even recognizes Jefferson's axiomatic acceptance of the great chain of being in the latter's notes on the state of Virginia and his even more significant adherence to the objectively hierarchical character of natural variation. The point is that race, a term that had come into widespread use, already referred to unequal groups. The inequality had been established even before the application of the term. And that's part of the mental image that's held in the minds of the whites, which was also transferred into the minds of the blacks. In the writings of pro-slavery individuals, and even some individuals who were anti-slavery but viewed the Negro as a being apart, we see the nearly complete transformation of the Negro into a subhuman creature. And that's one of the consequences of falling into the hand of the English. They whipped that 9.0 version of slavery onto the people and they turned them into something that never existed upon the face of the earth. That 9.0 had all the bells and whistles. It had all the upgrades and everything they needed. This would have been even jaw-dropping to the slave masters in the ancient world, who could have never imagined anything close to these type of ideas. But the English and the white elite, they could, right? Now let's finish up. This grotesque monster, more ape than human, was perpetuated as much by the writing of scholars as by members of the white public, whose repugnance toward blackness was in turn increasingly fueled by such writings. In the eyes of many whites in both the North and the South, the Negro had been transformed into a degraded and contemptible creature by the turn of the 19th century. And understand that these ideas filtered down from where they were being crafted at the top all the way through until it reached the Negro, who received the brunt of these ideas, right? And it jacked up their psychology. There's no other way to put it. That's what it did. And it would have done the same thing to anyone else who was caught in this situation. And so we can see these people were working overtime to establish these ideas and implement them as fundamental truths within the society. And so after they released the Negroes from the physical chains, it was these types of chains that lingered onto the minds of their descendants, right? These types. And the thing is, they never gave out the complete set of keys to fix these problems, right? They never told the people up front how the Europeans invented the black people and how they created these concepts to mold the minds and the culture and the consciousness of the blacks. And so what they do in school is they feed people a very generic and watered down version of slavery, which is narrated in a way to produce a victim complex and continue the assumption of an inferior status, right? And if they presented it through this lens that we're going over, then a whole bunch of kids would have a whole lot of questions, right? And many of them would have enough sense to see things and to do things differently. But what happens is when they give that watered down version, then the children grow up, right? And they come into adulthood with these hardened ideas about the past, which makes it very difficult to make any changes. And so the children, when they're young, they don't have all this baggage with them. They're very impressionable, and it's easy to train them, right? Which is why in the Bible you have Jesus saying, unless you become like little children, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven, right? That's referring to a childlike state of receptivity to a new perspective in order to receive a higher consciousness. And so understand the message and also understand the things that have to be done. There's a lot of things that have to be unlearned, a lot of things that have to be unpacked, because there's a long hike up the mountain to mental freedom, right? It's long. And there's a lot of tools that have to be brought along this hike. But on the other hand, the hike is very doable, right? But it's only doable to those that desire to do it. That's it. And so hopefully this video has been helpful. Hopefully it has given you some extra light to find your way on the path. I want to thank you right now for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.